Hey, good evening, everybody. This is your host, Nevin Gusak of the recently renamed show New Ideas. Um, with me is a good friend of the program, is a university lecturer professor, Matt McManus. Matt is a socialist, but a liberal socialist. He's not a Stalinist by any means. He's not a National Socialist. We're actually going to be talking about National Socialism and Fascism. Might have a little debate, or at least a productive discussion. We're going to talk about the contradictions between the goals of conservatism versus its policies. We're going to talk about some works that he is working on right now, some different writing projects, research projects, and anything else comes up. Maybe we could even talk about the incoming Trump, Musk, Vance administration. So I think this is going to be a fun conversation. Matt was a great guest the last time. And since I am politically homeless, I'm pretty open to everybody across the political spectrum within reason. Of course, I generally will have kind of uncomfortable conversations with totalitarians of all stripes. So that is kind of out of the picture. So welcome to the show, Matt. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. It's great to be back. Merry Christmas or happy holidays to anyone who celebrates, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. So we're going to start off with some conversations. We're going to talk about your good friend, James Lindsay. Now, one thing that James and I have in common, we both say we're anti-communists, but I sometimes glimpse at his Twitter, and maybe I am just dumb or something, but he's like throwing in and lumping in National Socialism and communism within this current stakeholder capitalism. And there were some times where I've lost my temper with him, to be honest. I did not appreciate him making fun of Tim Walz's mentally challenged son. I don't know if you saw some tweets. I thought that was disgusting and very revelatory about possibly a side of his personality and unjustified bullying. And that's one of the issues I have with a portion of the so-called conservative and so-called libertarian movements. When we take a look at who they go after, and this is back in the strategies of, for example, Lee Atwater and Paul Weyrich, who we talked with former vice presidential candidate Pat Choate about, picking on easy targets, individuals that have very little power as individuals. Do we see him picking on Elon Musk, for example? No. Do we see him talking about other powerful individuals, people with individual power who are not exactly always pro-American? No. So, I mean, with Lindsay, stakeholder capitalism, my understanding, is pre-Reagan capitalism. It didn't just start with Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, which I have problems with. The little bit I've researched on their collaboration with Russia and Putin and China, I have problems with that. But the notion of stakeholder capitalism is very old. I mean, it started even predated the New Deal, for example. The notion, Dean Edwin Gay of Harvard University in 1908 lectured his students that, you have to perform good business practices, take care of your community, your consumers, your customers, your workers. And then, of course, the post-World War II and New Deal consensus in the West was, again, you have to balance the needs of the shareholders / investors, your community and nation, your consumers, and your employees. That's my understanding of stakeholder capitalism, which was a good antidote to the twin anti-capitalist extremisms of fascism and communism. So what is going on with James Lindsay? I get a headache a little bit with some of his ex-posts. Some of it's spot on from my perspective, but a lot of it is, it's almost like, I don't know if he's lying consciously or just misinterpreting history. He's not a stupid man, but so what's going on with him?
Sure. I think I'll break this up into 3 different segments, if that's okay. I'll talk a little bit about how I know Lindsay and a little bit about what Lindsay did. Then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of meanness that you're talking about. And then we'll move into what he represents politically. Does that work?
Sounds cool.
Okay, cool.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so Lindsay and I are actually only about 2 degrees of separation from one another because most people know him for the so-called so-called squared controversy or scam or whatever you want to call it, right? This was kind of an instance where a bunch of different academics, journalists, disaffected liberals submitted a variety of different papers to woke left-leaning academic journals on ridiculous topics with the hope of getting them published. And that's exactly what ended up happening. And of course, the ambition was to effectively ridicule woke academia or politically correct or postmodern academia, whatever you want to call it. And probably the most well-known of these writers initially was a woman named Helen Pluckrose, whose magazine, REO Magazine, I actually wrote for a very long time. It no longer exists, but you can still see some of the articles I produced for that on the Colette-led site, I believe, right now. Now, Helen considered herself rather like Sokol himself to be a kind of left liberal, somebody who was deeply respectful of, in her case, the labor movement, labor agitation in the United Kingdom. Sokol himself, for those who don't know, was a physicist who was kind of tired of left-wing intellectuals appropriating terms from the physical sciences in order to make what he thought were theoretically baseless claims. But Sokol himself always said that he was a good socialist who believed in anti-capitalism, the working class being emancipated, and he kind of wanted to save the left from as he put it, a trendy version of himself. Now, Pluckrose and Lindsay co-authored a book together talking about critical theory. Now, whatever else you think about the book, it became something of a bestseller, certainly for a work that spends a lot of time talking about people like Deleuze, Foucault, those kinds of types. And Helen remained kind of steadfastly committed to left liberalism, and James Lindsay very, very, very clearly decided to at least partially embrace the quite right-wing audience that his infamy brought him. And there, for a little while, there was kind of a tension about whether or not he was going to be a kind of centrist figure, more right-wing. And what he seems to have decided upon is that he's a very trollist, very Trumpy kind of classical liberal or libertarian, right? His thinking on this isn't exactly all that consistent. If you read a book like Race Marxism, where he describes his theory of the good, it's mostly just a couple of references to the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, other kind of classical liberal icons. But then moving on to the second point, you were asking about, well, why the meanness, right? Why the picking on his kid, that kind of thing. And I think there are 2 explanations for this, one kind of superficial and then one that's a little bit deeper. So the superficial reason, I think, again, is that James attracted a very right-wing, very, very online kind of audience for whom those kinds of displays are, their bread and butter, right? Anybody who's been on Twitter, certainly post-Musk, knows that seeing people criticize children, seeing people say Nazi type things, it's not at all unusual, really. It's just in a kind of day's work for being an online figure. And I think he recognizes that he needs to pander to that quite a bit. That's really the only explanation I can come up with for why a grown man in his 40s would be making, say, your mom jokes in public, let alone criticizing a child who by all accounts is a very nice person, but has certain kinds of physical and mental disabilities, right? But I think the deeper reason relates back to what my good friend Aaron Ross Powell once said about the transition of the libertarian movement under Trump more generally. And I'll add the classical liberal movement there as well. So for those who don't know, Aaron Ross Powell is a good friend of mine. He worked with the Cato Institute for a very long time, in a leadership role, I should say. Still identifies as a libertarian, but a left libertarian. You can go listen to his podcast, Reimagining Liberty, where I've had some very stimulating and very interesting debates on the right way to understand the future of liberalism and libertarianism, rather like what you and I have, right? And Aaron said something that I thought was extremely insightful, where he said, the sad reality is that he realized post-Trump especially that some people were attracted to libertarianism and classical liberalism because they had this deeply anti-hierarchical mindset. And they saw the state fundamentally as the single biggest force of domination in society. And so their goal with reducing the state, of course, was to produce a more equal, free, and ultimately flourishing society for all, right? And this is still a line of thought that continues through left libertarianism today, with people like Aaron or Matt Walensky or John Tomasi, all of them kind of argue for variations of this position. And I want to be clear, I have a lot of respect for it, right? I have disagreements about the right way to achieve a society free of non-domination. Obviously, I think something more like the Nordic model of social democracy is a better fit than left libertarianism, but more or less we have the same kind of aspirations. But Aaron pointed out that he realized there's a different kind of libertarian whose fundamental outlook is that actually it's the state that is the single biggest barrier to forming the kinds of domination that would exist there but for it offering protections to people who are unworthy of protection. These are the kinds of libertarians who will go online and talk about how it's a real shame things like the Civil Rights Acts were passed or segregation was ended, because if private businesses want to segregate on the basis of race, then by all means they can do so. Or think about Herman Hoppe, right? If a domineering capitalist like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel essentially wants to create an absolute monarchy within a certain space and has the resources to do so, then they should not be prohibited from doing so by democracy or any kind of state entity. And so really from their perspective, this kind of right libertarian or right classical liberal outlook, the state is the biggest barrier for the achievement of the forms of hierarchical organization that they think a proper society would instantiate. And I think Lindsay very much falls within that paradigm, right? And this is one of the reasons, and this will be my third point, for his kind of fixation or fascination with Marxism as an extremely catch-all term for more or less anything that he doesn't like. Now, I want to be very clear. His use of this term Marxism or woke Marxism or race Marxism is extremely analytically unrefined, right? Anybody who says that ultimately Chairman Mao, Adolf Hitler, and Kamala Harris belong in the same political space doesn't deserve to be taken intellectually seriously, right? I mean, I don't like any of those people. I wouldn't have voted for Kamala.
Neither do I.
Yeah, I definitely not vote for Mao or Hitler, right? But, you know, I can appreciate that they had different views on, let's put it this way, a wide array of different things. In fact, Kamala is probably a lot less bad than either Hitler or Mao, right? But the reason for this fixation—
I would say so.
Exactly. But the reason for this fixation on Marxism is Lindsay really seems to think that there's this kind of leveling impetus that's largely emerging from the left. And you can see aspects of that, he thinks, emerging on the right also, with this kind of collectivist push for various forms of nationalist programs that'll be accompanied by state intervention that might also include certain forms of redistributive or ameliorative programs. And Lindsay doesn't like any of that, which is why he kind of paints it all with the same brush. And I think the lesson that we can learn from this is that we really need to be very, very careful about any kind of political outlook that's dyadic, right? That says everyone who's on my side and believes exactly what I believe is good, you know, an individualist, for liberty, for equality, for America, etc. And everyone who does not agree with me is not only bad, but a species of the same kind of bad thing, just different permutations of Marxism or wokeism or whatever it happens to be. There are a lot of bad things out there in the world. Let's be very clear about it. But that's part of the problem. There are a lot of different bad things out there in the world, and we need to kind of understand them independently if we're going to confront them effectively as liberals.
Exactly. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, there's a long tradition of lumping in social democracy and all forms of nationalism, including healthy civic nationalism and populism, both toxic and more inclusive populism, with National Socialism, Fascism, Communism. And that was something I would argue is a mistake that the right libertarians had done during World War II and after World War II. And I think there's the historical roots for that. And you're right, lumping in Kamala Harris, Hitler, and Mao, they're very important differences, and they're completely different characters. And, you know, I sent you some of my essays, and I tagged you on Twitter or X on this.
I wanted to pay a compliment. I really did enjoy your piece on National Socialism, the KKK, the different kinds of right nationalist movements emerging in the United States right now. I thought that was very insightful.
Well, and I appreciate that, especially coming from a scholar and an academic such as you, and you're coming from a different political tradition than I am. I mean, but we're kind of having civil conversations because we see similar problems that have developed from neoliberalism. You should definitely take a look at my Hard Truth of Capitalism series. You'll find that very interesting and sobering. And my paper is kind of proof. I mean, you can definitely detect some undertones of some right-wingy thought. you're a seasoned political observer, but you have to have a certain level of honesty, because when you're studying extremist and radical ideologies, there is a lot of nuance. You can't lump in Kamala Harris with Hitler and Mao. I mean, it's just stupid. I mean, I don't even want to use politically incorrect terms on air and offend the audience or you, but you know, it's been a long time. It's been a long process within elements of conservatism and libertarianism, and my concern is that poisoning the discourse for younger generations who want to go into a conservative movement. I would like to see a healthy conservative movement. Not only that, another thing which really disturbs the hell out of me, and frankly is intellectually not entirely honest, where he uses the term woke right. And he is implicitly, I don't know if you saw those tweets, he implies, he doesn't mention names, but he implies when he says woke right or the new right, you know who uses the term new right often? Orrin Cass and his colleagues at American Compass. And just to throw in Tucker Carlson, National Socialists, you know, and James, if you want to respond to this, either on my X account or on this YouTube video, I know you don't subscribe. I have a smaller following than you. Please do so. I mean, enlighten me. But you can't lump all those together. And I don't know, I don't want to sound cynical or maybe like a Marxist myself, but is this guy getting money from plutocratic donors that we don't know about? I know some of the anti-Jewish, racist, National Socialist, neo-fascist types have suggested that. And for us, I mean, the three of us, for James, you and I, one thing that we do have in common is at least we reject those forces. But then again, I have to wonder, is he getting money under the table? He's constantly on Twitter. He seems to make a living constantly tweeting endlessly every second of the day, it seems, when I kind of run through his tweets and the time lapses and periods. He certainly is traveling and lectures. Now I understand he's going to give a speech at Turning Point USA, which used to be a corporate globalist organization. When you read Charlie Kirk's 2012 book, he's an apologist for outsourcing and also free trade, the typical Bush-Reagan economic globalism. I don't know if you read the book. I quoted it at one of my self-published books. Now, all of a sudden, I love how these people are reinventing themselves as America First type of Republicans. I find it kind of amusing, to say the least. But, and any thoughts about that? I mean, have you seen those tweets where he lumped in the new right, which is again what some of the people like the Orrin Casses and the Sarab Amaris and others are? I mean, it's just ridiculous. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I think this kind of relates back to what I was talking about earlier about the difficulties or the problems with the kind of dyadic approach to politics. And here, I really think the legacy of the Cold War casts a long shadow. So many right-wing intellectuals in the United States, but by no means all, tended to frame the Cold War as a confrontation between, you choose your dyad, collectivism versus individualism, or the West versus the East, or an open society and a free society versus a closed society and an authoritarian society. Everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with those, right? And kind of problem with this dyad, right, is it becomes very easy to insist that anything that you don't like belongs on the other side of it and is really, again, a species of the same kind of thing. And when that happens, the actual variation between different political views invariably gets lost, right? So one of the things that I always stress whenever I'm talking about political ideologies is political ideologies are, to be kind of glib, complicated, right? And even within big tent traditions like liberalism, like the left, like the right, there's an enormous amount of variation, right? So I often talk about, for instance, a family of liberal doctrines. So there are many species of liberalism that, like any member of your family, I'm not very fond of. I'm not very fond of neoliberalism. I have mixed feelings about classical liberalism. Definitely don't like right libertarianism, if it could even be called a species of liberalism. But I'm very amenable to things like left liberalism, social democracy, that kind of stuff. Liberal egalitarianism, as it's sometimes called. Now, when it comes to the political right, The political right is also extraordinarily diverse, and there's a kind of continuum of views that run the gamut from, let's call it ordered liberty conservatives, who are very friendly to many aspects of liberalism and certainly to the market. But I think that needs to be tempered by a respect for tradition, gradualist change, etc.
Like Russell Kirk, for example.
Yes, exactly, right. Or Patrick Devlin in the United Kingdom. You can, George Will would be a good example of that. Writing for the contemporary Washington Post, Jonah Goldberg. Much of these kind of, especially a lot of them have ended up becoming anti-Trump or never Trump kind of conservatives, precisely because they associate Trump as a figure who's moving too far from the liberal end of the spectrum. And then when you move a little bit further, you can find people like Christian Democrats. And I'd argue Sohrab Ahmari, in fact, I know he falls pretty clearly within that tradition because he's told me. And Christian Democrats, it's an unusual idea for the United States, which is partly why it's gained some traction because it's new. But
I've been called a Christian Democrat actually by someone who I was in touch with too. One person, I don't mean to interrupt, also described me as a Christian Democrat. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the exemplary Christian Democrat would be someone like Konrad Adenauer in West Germany, right? He's a figure who held generally pretty conservative social views, was inarguably far too soft on the Nazis, with this idea of kind of conciliating German society rather than seeking justice. But he was also comfortable with liberal forms, was clearly a friend of democracy, liked markets for the most part, but complemented a commitment to markets with a pretty robust social safety net of the sort that people like Sohrab want the United States to adopt here. And very often, Christian Democrats could form unions with moderate socialist or social democrats like the SPD. In fact, the Grand Coalition, so-called, is a characteristic feature of German politics right now. And the reason for this was these people were not extreme, even if they couldn't be characterized accurately as kind of ordered liberty conservatives or ordered liberty liberals in an American sense. And the only reason why people tend to lump them with the far right or with collectivism in the United States is, I think, just a lack of familiarity with alternate forms of conservatism than the one that they've been weaned on for a very long time in the US, which until Trump at least had a pretty pronouncedly anti-statist quality, right? Now, if you go further, quite a lot further on the political spectrum, what you get are, as you put it, things like National Socialism, Fascism, conservative authoritarianism, and a variety of other hard right or far right doctrines, right? And each of these is themselves quite distinct. So conservative authoritarianism would be something like the regime of Admiral Horthy in Hungary, which aligned itself to be with Hitler, to be clear, but wasn't necessarily fascistic because it didn't have a populist dimension. Or you can think of the Pinochet regime in Chile that governed for a long period of time through the late 20th century. Certainly a very conservative authoritarian regime, threw thousands of people in jail, tortured thousands of others, often with the support, sadly, of the United States, right? But not fascistic, again, in the sense of conjuring up these kinds of populist, nationalist, and racist energies. And then we have fascism and Nazism, right? And here we have to be very careful in kind of talking about these two things. So fascism can refer to a lot of different things, right? Many people, when they talk about fascism, are referring to the Italian Fascist Party, which came into being in the early 20th century, gained a large following, but not a mass following very, very quickly, was invited into government mostly by liberal and conservative forces, actually, partly to block the ascendancy of the socialists and the Marxists and the trade unions, and then governed, of course, up until 1943, when, because of the Allied invasion in Sicily, Mussolini's regime fell. He was later rescued by the Nazis and installed in a puppet regime in the Salerno Republic. That's not what most people talk about when they talk about fascism, though. What they're talking about is instead a kind of species of radical right ideology, or what's sometimes called generic fascism, of which Italian fascism and Nazism can both be categorized as members, albeit with important differences between them existing as well, which we can get into. So there's a lot of debate, huge amount of debate, about the right way to characterize so-called generic fascism, right? Although it's an important debate, right? Because you want to know if you find a fascist in the woods, how will you recognize them, right? What kind of unites them all together? So just to kind of give you my own preferred definition, I think that Roger Griffin is the one who gets closest to accurately labeling fascism from an ideological standpoint, where Roger Griffin, in a book, The Nature of Fascism, describes it as a form of palingenetic or populist palingenetic ultranationalism. basically, a fascist believes that the ultranation, which is this kind of transcendent entity, is the source of most meaning, most significance in life. It's usually coded in racial terms, right? So the Italian nation, the German nation, the German Volk, and in its darkest connotations, it's going to assume blood and soil type qualities, right? And it can even evolve in that direction, to be clear, right? So Italian fascism, for example, had quite a bit of racism baked into it, particularly directed against Africans. But later on, under the influence of German Nazism, started imbibing anti-Semitic qualities also, as the kind of blood and soil dimensions of fascism became more pronounced with the ascendancy of Hitler. But again, just go back. The idea is that the ultranation is the source of meaning, source of significance, but it's decayed for a long period of time. Why has it decayed? Well, there are a lot of different reasons for this that different fascist groups will give. It depends on the context, but usually it's because of a combination of decadent forces propagated by enemies who are typically on the left, but not exclusively on the left. And this is where we have to be careful, right? So all fascists are very critical of democracy, which is kind of decadent, slow, talk shop,
very capitalistic and plutocratic and whatnot. They often use the term democracy, and parliamentary democracy, and even our system is very plutocratic, controlled by the wealthy, which I don't want to legitimize the points of view of the extreme left or National Socialism or Fascism, which actually I consider neither classically right nor left, because there's important theoretical differences. But they are. I mean, we are a plutocracy, and I'd like a fascination abroad of United Healthcare. Maybe we'd take a deep dive a little bit in our totally unresponsive system. But go ahead. They feel that democracy is slow and decadent. And what are some of the other fascist and National Socialist beliefs according to your research?
Oh, of course. Now, to be clear, what you said is actually, I think, very insightful. And the Jewish Marxist philosopher Theodor Adorno once made exactly that point, where he suggested, look, sometimes, a fascist conspiracy theory is just a poor man's systems theory, right? Like there genuinely is a plutocratic system that denies ordinary people the opportunity to participate meaningfully in politics. Certainly, if you were in early 20th century Europe, that was undeniable, right? There were many authoritarian regimes that had the backing of big business. Nobody would argue with that. The problem was with the way that the fascists and the Nazis framed that, right? Which is not just a kind of systemic problem, but an anti-Semitic or a Semitic problem, right? The Jews are the strings and everything. If we get rid of them, we'll be fine. Which obviously has all kinds of horribly racist connotations that will eventually lead to the Holocaust, right? But we can talk about that later. Anyway, so democracy is bad. Liberalism is bad for all the reasons you mentioned. And usually National Socialists or fascists Italian fascists would lump elements of capitalism in with that. Now, there's a huge amount of controversy about that because both the Italian fascists and the German National Socialists reconciled in many cases with big business and other kind of conservative forces. Robert Paxton, who was the author of The Anatomy of Fascism, constantly stresses that fact. Like, there's no denying that neither Nazism or Italian fascism couldn't have come to power without the cooperation of big business, different kind of conservative forces like, say, the king in Italy, or the German National People's Party in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. However, the Nazis and the Italian fascists were certainly not pro-capitalist the way that, say, classical liberal would be pro-capitalist. They tended to believe in the existence of things like private property. They certainly promised to smash labor unions. And that brings me very nicely to the last major enemy, which are socialists, communists, feminists, anyone they associate with the kind of decadent egalitarianism of the left, right? Hitler was extremely overt about that in Mein Kampf, where he said the Jewish doctrine of Marxism, since he often conflated it together as Judeo-Bolshevism, undermines what he calls the aristocratic principle of nature, which is that races must compete in this kind of social Darwinian struggle for supremacy. And of course, the master race is supposed to gain ascendancy over all the weaker races, especially the Judaic race, right? But the reason for this complicated relationship with capitalism and conservatism is very often it was the case in, say, Italy or Germany, that conservatives and capitalists, big business, would have preferred a liberal regime or a conservative authoritarian regime. A lot of German conservatives, for instance, put their hopes on von Hindenburg, right, as a kind of a savior or even restorer of the ancien regime of, the Kaiser and the German Empire. But when they were faced with things like the ascendancy of socialism and communism and trade unionism and feminism, they thought, well, here's a populist movement that seems to have a lot of youth support, that's gaining in the polls, and that has the muscle, really, to really take the fight to these dangerous progressive forces. And so there was necessarily a kind of strategic alignment between the two of them in order to crush the left, which, to your point, is why many political scientists would say fascism and Nazism belong on the extreme right end of the spectrum, right? It's this kind of willingness to align with those forces to combat what they see to be their true enemy that kind of positions them there, amongst other things. But once these kind of enemies are gone, and this brings us to the more substantive dimension of their beliefs, fascists believe that there'll be a kind of nationalist restoration that occurs, that the ultra-nation will be rebirthed or restored, which is what the term palingenesis means, right? Rebirth or restoration, to Griffin's term. And the way that this rebirth is supposed to be carried out can have a lot of different forms depending upon where you look, but it will always mean the banishing of those they consider enemies, a kind of return to high levels of economic productivity where the so-called wealth of society will be distributed more productively, although not evenly, because private property will be retained. And very often, at least for classical fascism, in Italy and in Germany, this is also going to entail projects of mass military expansion, right? Italy, again, dreamed of forming a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean that would be proportionate to the glory of its history. Obviously, Adolf Hitler talked right from Mein Kampf onwards about forming an enormous German empire, for the most part, in Eastern Europe, where he would annihilate the Slavic peoples and the Jews and turn most of Eastern Europe and potentially beyond into something like the Germans' own British Empire. It was a frequent comparison he made, right, where it would be a kind of realm for colonization and exploitation. And he, would casually muse about how 20 or 30 million Slavs would have to die, probably through starvation, through this process. But, so much the better, right? Although other historians like Richard Evans, who I'm very fond of, points out that Hitler also very much contemplated expansion into Western Europe at various points as well, particularly taking out Germany's historical enemy, France, which the country had gone to war with 2 times within living memory by the time the Nazis came to power, Franco-Prussian War, then the First World War. And Goebbels in 1941 or 42, when he's talking about the invasion of Russia, talked about how world Jewry, apologies for the term, had achieved its kind of last, was making its last stand in North America. He was thinking about the United States. But he said, sooner or later, in the medium or long run, their time will come also. Very foreboding stuff, implying that at the kind of height of the Nazi empire, Goebbels was even contemplating the prospect that one day the Nazis would make their way to the United States and eliminate the other headquarters of world Jewry, as it was sometimes called, the U.S., the headquarters of world capitalism, much like the Soviet Union was the headquarters of world Bolshevism, right? Now, I'm not saying any of this makes sense. It's all completely conspiratorial and obviously extraordinary evil. But
it's evil. Yeah, it's totally evil. And I point that out, obviously, in my essays and my books. I mean, I talk a little bit about my own personal self. Obviously, I don't support those ideologies. My view on fascism and national... I'm sorry?
And very rightly so, right? I mean, they have brought untold suffering to the world. And one of the most deeply disturbing characteristics of our contemporary politics is how there's been a kind of... sorry, my cat wanted to join us.
Hey, we both got pets. Right now, I have my girlfriend's dog, so he's with me, laying down comfortably near my desk chair and whatnot. So no worries about the cat. It's totally evil, and I talk about in my one of my Substack essays in a self-published book called Brown Dawn on Nazi plans to subvert and ultimately collapse and occupy the United States. They had very, very sinister plans. I recently came across a journal article which talked about Nazi plans for Africa, which is a bizarre mix of extreme paternalism towards the native non-white population and out-and-out slavery, done by state corporations and party corporations and closely monitored private companies. Now, National Socialism and Fascism, very often, but not always, they view themselves as socialist. And the problem with discourse of capitalism and socialism is there's many different flavors of socialism. The way I would describe it, I mean, the dictionary definition based on my research, and I've actually talked to actual fascists who've read my pieces because they're very well documented. I mean, they're not going to like, obviously, the undertone. It's very clear where I'm going with it. It's a combination of a belligerent nationalism that usually is extremely and violently racialistic, but not always. Usually is hyper-militaristic. It is extremely collectivistic based on race and not class. Although National Socialists and Fascists and their collaborators, and that includes in militarist Japan, they will deploy pseudo-Marxist, vaguely pseudo-Marxist phraseology in order to go after some enemy, usually another country, or elements within a racial group that they don't like, that had or held power, like Jews in Germany, that had a degree of integration and influence. And by it I add, there were a number of highly patriotic Jews. In fact, there were Jews in Germany that wanted to become National Socialists. There were like one or two groups that actually tried to work with the Nazis, like the Association of German National Jews, for example. Their economic views are very interesting. I mean, they have a lot of multiple roots, you know, economists and academics and heads of political parties. I mean, you take a look at Hitler, for example, Mayor Karl Lueger of Vienna, who was a Christian socialist or Christian social. You had George von Schoenerer, who is a extreme racial collectivist and actually hated the Austrian school liberals, you know, that were very common because Ludwig von Mises and Menger and others, they advised the Austro-Hungarian Empire on economic policy. People like von Schoenerer, who was a mentor of Hitler, absolutely hated the classical liberals, the right liberals. Really extreme hatred. So there was a rejection of a largely free market or even a reasonably regulated form of capitalism, but they viewed Bolshevism also with equal disdain, primarily because they felt it was a false socialism. When the Nazis and their European allies invaded Russia or the Soviet Union, Goebbels noted in his diary, like, at last, and he was one of the many Nazi sympathizers with Bolshevism, Goebbels, that is. But he still said, at last, we're going to bring real socialism to Russia. I kid you not. And the Nazi propagandists and their collaborationists all over occupied parts of the Soviet Union, they all talked about, in Germany, we have real socialism. We have this Volksgemeinschaft. And their collaborators in all over Europe, we're all saying the same thing, pretty much. It was this idea that private property was to fulfill a social function. So basically, if the business person said, I need to take a dump, you have to go to a state commissar or party official, and they have to get the sign off and the approval. There was a tremendous amount of wage controls, price controls. Independent unions were completely smashed and organized in the case of Italy, or rather in Germany, in the Deutsches Arbeitsfront, the German Labor Front. It was all corporatist. And unfortunately, in today's discourse, corporatist and plutocracy is, look, I don't think Trump is a fascist, for example. I think Trump is a pseudo-populist, a fake populist, who's an unvarnished supporter, at least in policy for the most part, of unvarnished plutocracy. And as events unfold, and as we see the elements of the Trump administration congealing together, it's really the truth, and with the influence of Elon Musk. Yeah. Now, with that stated, so is Nazism or fascism socialism? To me, it's a neither right nor left proposition because they don't believe in the atomizing tendencies of the right or the left. That's why you have programs like the Hitlerjugend and the BDM, which is the German Women's Association, the Labor Front. It was all a state-mandated class collaboration. Now, big businesses view collaboration with Nazi Germany is very interesting. And I talk about that in my book, The Nazi War Against Capitalism. They did launch a war against capitalism, but we're going to put some asterisks here too as well. Big business was very split. I mean, Henry Ashby Turner has pointed this out. Rainer Zeitelman, who you and I disagree with, he's an extreme capitalist, but he has argued in his works, which are reasonably documented, where Hitler over time believed in private property, but within the framework of a planned economy. And as the years went by when he was in power as Reichschancellor, Hitler became more radical towards the property-owning classes, to the point where Goebbels, Hitler, Bormann, and others actually wanted to execute the capitalists after the war, at least or some of them, as well as nationalize portions of their property. And some Nazi defectors like Kurt Lüdecke had talked about that too as well, where Hitler said, look, I don't want to bring total socialism to Germany, because first we have to rearm and violate the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So it's a form of strategic pragmatism. Now, there were German capitalists like Paul Reusch, who was a large steel industrialist, that said, look, when the Nazi agitators or party people came to their meetings and asking them for money, Paul Reusch was absolutely correct and said, like, screw you, I'm not going to fund our gravediggers. He was right. And there were others. Some others supported, like Emil Kurdorf, mistakenly thinking that the Nazis were not socialists and that they really were an anti-Jewish, and we can do business with them, and they're going to smash the unions and they're going to dance to our tune. There were other German industrialists, especially after Hitler became chancellor. They saw the handwriting on the wall, and then they started to fund the May 1933 rigged German election, because it was a rigged election, because the KPD and the SPD were made illegal at that point, taking out a sizable portion of the electorate. So it was a mixed bag. I mean, Krupp von Bohlen said to a Swiss visitor in 1934 that the economic controls of the Nazis were so bad and so pervasive that we're no better than the natives of Timbuktu. Fritz Thyssen had to flee for his life because he was getting more and more, if you read the book, and Tom Hartman, the progressive populist commentator, has quoted his book, I Paid Hitler. And I've read it. I have a copy in my personal library. And he talks about how, look, we're going to be no better than the Bolsheviks in Russia, where the Nazis are dictating to us, the plan, and God forbid, if we don't fulfill the plan, we're going to be arrested and, brought up on charges of sabotage. But you see, like my essay, there's a lot of nuance with the Nazis. At the same token, they will not execute and kill the upper classes because they serve a useful purpose. And the Marxist-Leninists are very similar to that too. You're probably familiar, Marxist.org it is, covers Lenin's debate on the concessions to the foreign corporations in Russia. He talked about the need to use the cultured capitalists to rebuild Russia right after the Bolsheviks and him seized power in November 1917. You have, for example, Mao in China and the CCP. They collaborated with anti-Kuomintang capitalists in order to rebuild China, to the point of actually suppressing strikes in China on behalf of big business. In the first iteration or period of Sandinista power in Nicaragua, they were Marxist-Leninists, but again, they also kept a portion of the capitalist class going. As one of the Sandinistas, I don't know if it was Comandante Bayardo Arce or the Minister of Agriculture Wheelock, as well as this Nicaraguan Sandinista military defector talked about this, Roger Miranda Bengochea. And he talked about how there were textbooks in Nicaragua where, sure, they had the capitalists, but they prepared the food, but we kept them in the kitchen, so to speak. I kid you not. The kind of sardonic humor of Marxist-Leninists and whatnot. And the thing of it is that I look at totalitarianism as just a theology of power, and that's what it really comes down to. I mean, and American corporations, I talk about it in my Hard Truth of Capitalism and its conflicts with national security in my Hard Truth of Capitalism series. I mean, you had American corporations falling all over themselves to back National Socialist Germany, even though you could read the New York Times and read how businessmen in Germany were put in Dachau. I mean, the first head of the Gestapo, Rudolf Diels, admitted that reactionary, he called them asocial reactionary employees. That was a term of abuse. And the Nazis also did not like what they viewed were greedy businessmen or Germans. They were referred to as white Jews, as a matter of fact. And there were periodic discussions in the Nazi newspapers, including Der Schwarze Korps, for example, which talked about purges periodically of white Jews. But the other thing is they did not eliminate the profit motive. They did not eliminate private property. They wanted this synthesis where they had control, but they did not want to kill the goose that was laying the golden eggs. And we bring it up today. You look at how many, a portion of right libertarians, I mean, there are some good right libertarians, like the friend of the program, Tim Starr, who has opposed this, of course, giving credit where credit is due. But there were a number of right libertarians, like the Club for Growth and the Cato Institute, that shilled for trade for China, for the People's Republic of China and Putin's Russia, for example, and even the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, when the Cato Institute was formed by, I think in 1977, they were total decontrol of trade with the Soviet Union and all communist countries. Milton Friedman, contrary to what he Degree said in Capitalism and Freedom, written in 1962, by 1980, he called for the total deregulation of exports to the Soviet Union as a means of boosting American exports. I kid you not. So there's a lot of these weird things going on here. And the totalitarians know, they fully understand, in my opinion, the weaknesses of right libertarianism or right liberalism and uncontrolled capitalism. In a way, Marx was correct when he stated in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie are their own gravediggers. And that's why I've come around first on national security grounds on why that capitalism needs controls. And that's why I titled my essays A Hard Truth of Capitalism. It's not because I want to wipe out the system in its entirety. I look at things through a national security lens too as well. Now, and this is where people on the left would probably get freaked out by my stress on national security. But at the end of the day, you, my quote unquote socialist friend or liberal socialist friend, China or Russia dominates the world or the tankies come to power. I mean, rest assured, Matt, a half of your community will be exterminated. Just like Hitler went after quote unquote socialists and communists, he also absorbed many communists for different reasons within the SA and to a lesser degree in the party apparatus. Lenin killed Mensheviks, the left communists, Alexander Shliapnikov's workers' opposition, anarchists. They were killing them like it wasn't out of style. And by the way, bringing in members of the Black Hundreds, as Mikhail Gursky and Richard Pipes has pointed out, bringing in Black Hundreds into into the Cheka and into the party apparatus and their puppet Orthodox church that Lenin and then later Stalin developed. So, that's my take. And this is where I think the people like the Comintern, like Georgy Dimitrov, for example, had said that fascism is just reaction, the last stand of reactionary capital. I don't agree with that. But also, I got to tell you, people like Jonah Goldberg, if you ever read his book, Liberal Fascism, I mean, there's a lot of good facts in there, but he comes from the wrong conclusion where people just lump in fascism and communism and socialism. It's like what Javier Milei said, and it really irritated the hell out of me. Let me see if I can find his speech. I hope I could find it here, where he basically lumped in Christian democracy, social democracy, Keynesianism, fascism, communism, populism, nationalism, and globalism. And he said it was just all pretty much the same thing because it's animated by collectivism. I really hope I can find this because I really want to read it. Okay, he said in a speech before the World Economic Forum on January 18th, 2024, the West has unfortunately already started to go along this path. I know to many it might sound ridiculous to suggest the West has turned to socialism, but it's only ridiculous if you only limit yourself to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which says that it's an economic system where the state owns the means of production. This definition, in my view, should be updated in light of the current circumstances. Today, states don't need to directly control the means of production to control every aspect of lives of the individuals. With tools such as printing money, debt, subsidies, controlling the interest rate, price controls, and regulations to correct so-called market failures, they can control the lives and fates of millions of individuals. This is how we come to the point where by using different names or guises, a good deal of the generally accepted ideologies in most Western countries are collectivist variants. Whether they proclaim to be openly communist, fascist, socialist, social democrats, national socialists, Christian Democrats, neo-Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. Ultimately, there are no major differences. They all say that the state should steer all aspects of the lives of individuals. They all defend a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. And as a counter, and I'll get your comments about everything I said before either we move to the next subject and then wrap up, as Gus D. Zariga, former friend and political counselor of Charles Koch, remarked, he was quoted as saying, as state socialism failed, the target for many within these Koch-funded organizations shifted to any kind of regulation at all. Quote, socialism, supposed socialism, kept being defined downwards. And I think his statement goes to the crux of the matter. It's really, there's this, even with intelligent people, there is just, I don't know how to term it without sounding rude, but it's like this mental block. It's like, it's just so patently dishonest. I mean, how could you lump in National Socialists want to dominate steer the individual's lives? Communism, fascism, certain toxic forms of populism and nationalism. But really, neo-Keynesianism, you really going to say Franklin Roosevelt, even theoretically, who said in our personal ambitions, we are individualists, but as an economy and politics, we all go up or down as one nation. It's very different. The lived experience of the New Deal is fucking different than Hitler's Germany, Ba'athist Iraq, Perón's Argentina, or whatever. It's just crazy. And oh, by the way, Milei has no problem with private sector corporations in Argentina doing business with China. So isn't that interesting? So what do you have to? So what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of different things there, and unfortunately, I have to go after this comment because we're coming up on 9:30. So I'll break it down into three separate components, right? Again, although I do want to say that, it's not a surprise that how the MLA looks that way. I mean, when the only weapon you have is a chainsaw, everything just looks like a state that you need to cut down. So we'll talk first about, the kind of Nazi fascism economic question, and then we'll move on to the different permutations of that persist to this day. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own kind of thoughts. So in terms of the kind of economy that the Nazis and the fascists had, I think that we need to avoid two mistakes. One is a very frequent mistake that I see many Americans make, which is, again, to try to locate political practices of European states in some analog in American society. This is, to the Jonah Goldberg part, exactly the kind of problem that people like Goldberg make, right? They say, well, Hitler wanted certain kind of big society programs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted some kind of big society programs. Ergo, there's a kind of fascist component to the New Deal, which, as you point out, is just nonsense. The second thing that we need to avoid thinking is, again, that there's a kind of dyadic distinction that exists between socialism and capitalism, and that though you're closer to one or the other, when the reality is that all kinds of experimentation in between or close to one extreme or the other is very much possible, right? And very often, that's certainly what contemporary fascists and many classical fascists said they were trying to achieve, a kind of third way between capitalism and socialism and, decadent libertarianism, along with, kind of mass collectivism of the sort that you saw in the Soviet Union. There's many National Socialists and fascists claim that they're going to make the societies more free. So we'll talk about Germany as a kind of main case study here, since that's probably the most interesting one for many people. So German conservatism and the German right, going all the way back to the 19th century, even arguably the 18th century, has always been notably more statist than the forms of conservatism or right-wing thought than you've seen, that you can see in, say, the United States, where there's a much more pronounced kind of anti-statism. Now, there are a variety of different reasons for this that scholars dispute. One good example of this, of course, is that the German state very much needed to be constructed by Prussian imperial power in this case, which required a kind of top-down approach in order to create the sense of national identity and belonging in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have required a major state to do the same kind of thing in the United States, although some people say that it did. Secondly, many people will point out that the kind of intellectual currents that influenced many segments of the, for instance, the German right, also had a much more nationalist and a much more statist kind of component. Let's just talk briefly about the kind of three core antecedents or participant intellectuals in the Nazi movement. So Oswald Spengler, author of Decline of the West, who himself was not a Nazi and repudiated Nazism, nonetheless put forward this idea of a kind of conservative or national socialism as early as the 1920s, suggesting, qua your comment, that this wouldn't mean the elimination of private property. That's what the actual socialists had gotten mistaken. Private property would still exist. But it would mean that private property was submitted to the moral imperatives of a strong nation state. And private property would be organized so that its benefits would be nationalized effectively, right? Now, how this is to be attained, Spengler didn't really go into a lot of detail about it, but he hypothesized that this might be the future and that a kind of Caesar-type figure might eventually enact such a program. Although when Hitler and Mussolini came along, he thought they were too populist and vulgar. Then you have somebody like, say, Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger, very important German philosopher whose works are very much worth reading, irregardless of his political views, I should say, with some reluctance. But he also felt that what was necessary in order to kind of overcome the decadence of both liberalism and capitalism, which he said was metaphysically the same, was a kind of resurgence of German power, the people of the center, as they were called, and that the resurgence of German power would allow for a kind of reflourishing of Western civilization. And then you also have Carl Schmitt, right? Very similarly, deeply critical of liberalism and socialism, characterizing them both as humanist doctrines whose mythologies were of transient quality and far less interesting and engaging to him than the kind of specter of statist power to enact a theological vision that we focused on a program of national renewal. So these intellectual currents are all important in German society also. And there's a few other examples that we can get to, but just because we're running out of time, when you end up getting to the Nazi state, it's important to note that the Nazis were a political party, first and foremost, right? Very often we talk about things like Nazi ideology or the Nazi philosophy, so-called, right, that Hitler argued for in Mein Kampf, or that Rosenberg argued for in The Myth of the 20th Century. But, oh, sorry, that's not the name of the book. But anyway, so the idea is that, there's this kind of unified core set of principles that they're agitating for. Actually, like any other political party, the Nazis would very often take and borrow from what appeared successful in order to try to make their case to the German people. And their enemies in the SPD, and for that matter on the German right, would often talk about the kind of chameleon-like disposition that Nazi politicians would adopt with whoever they were interacting with. If they would talk to farmers in rural areas, invariably they present themselves as these kind of blood and soil nationalists who thought that what we needed was a restoration of good old socially conservative values, that the decadent, almost invariably Semitic quality of the cities was seeping out in the country, and we didn't want that. If they were talking to university students, like say Heidegger did in his rectoral address, instead there would be this kind of militaristic call to national renewal, in which they were supposed to play a major part. And very often, almost a kind of revolutionary quality was associated with Nazism, right? That the country was going to be on the move again, because the decadent forces of socialism, democracy, liberalism, all of them had been defeated, and they could participate in this way, and that they would be truly free only by doing so. And we can go through on a variety of other kind of examples of this. And some of this actually reflected real tensions within the party itself, which was quite schizophrenic in its early days, precisely because of the wide variety of different groups that it was trying to reach out to. So, for instance, the Strasse-right wing of the party, the left wing of the Nazi party, so-called, often was much more militantly anti-capitalist than what Hitler, at least initially, would sign off on. Almost invariably, the Strassers would associate capitalism with Jewish control of big industry, because of course they would, right? But they would still characterize themselves as fundamentally socialist, not because they believed in equality. Strasser fundamentally rejected that, but because he believed that capitalism was inherently chaotic. It inherently led to this kind of libertine individualism. It allowed, of course, the influence of Jewish culture and Jewish materialism into society, and all that needed to go. Now, when you flash forward to 1932 and 1933, the party pivoted to the right end of the spectrum with Hitler, precisely in order to conciliate with the German National People's Party, von Hindenburg, and German big business, which saw them as an antidote, again, to forming a coalition government with the SPD or the KPD, which none of them wanted to do. Of course, Hitler ended up passing the Enabling Act, often again with the support of the most conservative forces in German industry, and became a dictator. Now, in terms of the shape that the Nazi economy took, there are a lot of different accounts of this, and I think we need to be careful in rejecting quite a few of the older ones. As you point out, there was this old Marxist criticism of Nazism that characterized it as a form of reactionary capitalism, or the last stage of capitalism, or even state capitalism, so-called, right? And for the most part, those are of very, very limited value. But there was also this propensity on the part of some liberal economists, like von Mises, for example, who initially supported Italian fascism before changing his tune, or offered at least apologias for Italian fascism before changing his tune. And he would say, well, no, actually, this is all just another species of collectivism, per what you're talking about. Really, the differences between National Socialism and, say, Soviet socialism, they're cosmetic, right? And that isn't accurate, right? The actual Nazi economy was organized something on somewhat of a happenstance basis, because the Nazis, for the most part, were far more interested in their geopolitical and domestic objectives than they were any kind of economic program. And I think this is where we can gain some important insight into Nazi ideology that Heidegger understood, but I think a lot of people in the Anglosphere don't, right? So for many in the Anglosphere, an emphasis on economics would be central to any kind of political program. The Nazis would often associate this emphasis on economics with Jewish materialism, libertine permissiveness, humanism, and the idea that the best kind of society is one that delivers consumer goods to people and allows them to enjoy their life. That was not what Nazism was focused on, right? Nazism was focused on, if anything, sacrifice for the nation, and eventually, of course, to the party and the state, for the purposes of imperial aggrandizement. And when they criticized bourgeois values and communism in the same breath. A lot of this is what they were attacking, right? This idea that really what we should be debating when we're debating politics is whether socialism more efficiently produces refrigerators and distributes them, or capitalism more efficiently distributes refrigerators and distributes them. Many Nazis had no interest in those kind of questions and thought they were actually really besides the point. From Hitler's standpoint, he characterized socialism or National Socialism as just how to manage the people, or the Volk, right? That was it. And in terms of his economic program, as you say, it was extremely pragmatic. Sometimes, for instance, the Nazis would privatize big business. They basically got rid of a lot of shares the German state had in German steel in order to raise money for rearmament. Of course, they trashed trade unions, smashed the SPD, smashed the KPD. They actually got rid of a lot of the welfare programs that had existed under the Weimar Republic, precisely because they thought the so-called work shy needed to get back to work, and if they wouldn't, then they'd be enslaved or worse, be thrown in jail and killed. But as you point out, the Nazi state was also very, very comfortable with developing certain kinds of cronyist corporatism, where people like Hermann Goering would be put on charge of vast swaths of industry, and a lot of people like Evans and Newman have stressed how there's sometimes this interpretation of the Nazi economy as something like a well-oiled machine, where everyone had their place and everyone did their job. Actually, what would often happen is Hitler would tell a bunch of different people to do the same kind of thing, not be very specific about how it was meant to be done, and leave it open to them to please him, because as a narcissist, that was a big part of what he wanted, right? And so some people would move in a more statist direction. Other people would privatize industry and try to shore up support from business. In many ways, the Nazi economy was quite a mess. And I'm not the first one to say that had the war not broken out, it almost invariably would have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and cronyism. However, the war did break out. And what you saw in the Nazi state, as with every state that was a participant in the Second World War, was, of course, more state control of the economy, certainly post-1942, when the Battle of Stalingrad necessitated, as Goebbels put it, a transition to total war. Although even then, they tried to keep domestic production up to comparatively high levels until 1944, when that just became impossible. So I think the lesson that we have to take about from this is that it's extremely important not to project a kind of Anglo-centric interpretation of politics or economics into contexts where those don't belong. Obviously, there are things that we can learn from our own traditions and our own histories that are of value when looking at other countries, but we have to respect that they have their own cultures too, right? So when we appreciate that the German right was far more statist, Otto von Bismarck introduced some of the world's first welfare programs, right? And yes. So precisely in order to offset the appeal of a kind of burgeoning socialist movement, arguing that the state should be a kind of paternalistic force in the lives of its people. Though, of course, they wouldn't get democracy or anything like that, right? They still had to submit to the Kaiser and national aggrandizement and that kind of thing. And when you recognize that German statism was central to the German right, and that the Nazi economy was in no way, shape, or form part of a grand conscious plan, but very much more drawing upon these reservoirs and instincts within German reactionary and German revolutionary spaces, you can understand a lot more of why it ended up looking like it did. Kind of a mishmash of different programs, different initiatives, people engaging in crony capitalism and crony statism all over the place, before eventually transitioning to what Hitler really always wanted it to be, in my opinion, which was a gigantic war machine where the people would be totally mobilized to pursue these grand and murderous plans of imperial expansion that, of course, were inevitably going to entail the mass starvation and genocide of millions. So,
which thankfully was defeated too, as well. And to close off, and I thank you so much for appearing on the program. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to converse maybe next week. Perhaps we'll schedule something on the assassination of Brian Thompson and the dysfunctional nature of American health insurance and shareholder value-driven capitalism. So we'll talk about that. But thankfully it was defeated because, as Albert Speer, I believe it was Albert Speer, who was the former Minister of Armament, said, at post-World War II in an interview, he said, had the Nazis won, the world would have been an absolute nightmare, to quote him. And I think, that can't be understated. And the groups still exist. They are small, but they do penetrate various spaces, police, military. As I pointed out in my essay, that's where the former National Alliance founder and leader, Dr. William Pierce, a very deranged man, if you read the testimony of his son, kind of father he was. This is the kind of world they wanted, and he recommended to his members to penetrate the police, the military, politics. Various clan groups had said the same thing. This essay is of course, what I'm referring to is why I oppose fascism and National Socialism on my Substack. But in order to outflank extremist movements, we have to offer something better. The liberal system has to offer something better. We have to recognize real grievances and enact the proper political and social reforms to further improve the system, to pull the plug on any extremist movements. Matt, where can people find your books, your articles, any YouTube videos? Where can they find your work?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at MattPaulProf. It's kind of a cesspool right now, but still every now and then worth engaging in. Or you can just send me an email, mattmcmanus300@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. Much appreciated. And I will send the interview to you once it's done. I'll tag you on X. And thank you again. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays to everyone out there in the audience. God bless.
And happy Hanukkah to yourself, by the way. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Happy Hanukkah, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Merry Christmas to you and your family. Be kind to each other. Stay safe. And let's all have hopefully a good 2025.
Yes. Take care.
All righty. All righty.